I'm Jaap. I'm here to talk about navigating around the edge with PowerShell. And the idea of this session is to talk about how can you use PowerShell in an environment where everything is not the way you want it to be. Because we all like the new stuff, we like the cool stuff, but the new and the cool stuff are not always available. So what do you do if you want to get information out of server 2003? Or what if PowerShell remoting is blocked? Is anyone in you in an organization where you've heard, oh, PowerShell remoting is not very secure, maybe we shouldn't enable it? That's a problem I've also ran into. And the topic of this presentation will be based on my own experience. I worked in managed services, and managing infrastructure of someone else is always a bit challenging because it is always very well documented. You know exactly what you're going to get, and nothing ever goes wrong in those kind of environments. So the point I'm going to address here is, what are you going to do when you end up in a situation where you have to get information out of a whole bunch of systems, and PowerShell remoting is not available? So it's always easy if you have PowerShell remoting, invoke command, enter PS session. You can do this against one server, you can do this against a couple thousand servers. That's quite easy. So if you have the time, you can always, of course, upgrade PowerShell to a correct version. So you actually have PowerShell remoting available. You can set up the GPOs, make sure you can access all the systems. But sometimes something goes wrong, and before you're able to get to the point that that everything is configured well, something might happen. So I'm not sure if you've heard about WannaCry or the Spectre bug, not Spectre Ops, Spectre bug. Oh, there we go. There, nothing ever goes wrong. So I was placed in a situation where I needed to find out, okay, we have a couple thousand client systems. Everything is running some version of Windows mostly. At least Windows is the part that I was interested in, because Linux was not my responsibility. So what are we going to do? We know we have a mixed environment, and we want to make sure that our systems are correctly patched. And I've already alluded to the fact that not everything is well documented. We didn't actually have patch management in place, so we needed a quick and dirty solution. Well, not so much dirty, but we needed a quick solution so we could get the information out of the system. So what do? Well, obviously we're going to use PowerShell, because this is the PowerShell conference and we all love PowerShell, right? Right? There we go. Oh, person in the back. Can you please stand up? Blue shirt. Well, we can run PowerShell on Linux now, right? So let's see. So how are we going to get this data out of the systems? We'll start with something easy. The systems that have PowerShell remoting enabled, how are we going to query for information? So let's go into that. So I'm going to make this as big as possible. Can we read this in the back? Do we have enough contrast for this? Someone in the back, is this okay? Good. So first things first, we're going to set up our credentials. So my password is, well, I should probably not share this because I'm on a LAN with you guys. So anyway, export it to CLI, import it again. Is everyone familiar with the export and import CLI commandlets? Fantastic. Don't have to go into that because I'll be using that later in my presentation. So we have our credential object, psconview, and we want to retrieve some information out of system. So I'm running everything locally, but I'm pretending now this is a PowerShell 5 system, so we have all the modern commandlets available. We can execute everything we want. So let's connect with ourselves. So in a PowerShell remote session, we do get computer info, and well, as expected, we just get the info we want. So if we would want to know what kind of hotfixes are available, get hotfix, and we can see exactly which security updates are installed. So for all your modern systems, if you want to retrieve this information, very easy using PowerShell remoting. Let's get out of there. We can also have a PowerShell session, do invoke command, get the same information out of there. And if we take a look at what kind of output we get, and we take a look at the type, you can see we get PowerShell objects, so we get nice structured data. Structured data, we want to have that because if we're going to run queries against a couple hundred, couple thousand servers, we need to be able to store this somewhere and be able to filter on, okay, which systems do we have to take action on? Where do we have to do patching? Where do we have to disable SMB1? Well, there's hardly any reasons why you would want to disable SMB1, of course, because it gives you free access everywhere. So, nothing too exciting so far. It's just PowerShell remoting. We've all used this a lot of times. But what are we going to do when we have a mixed environment? So we have server 2003. There might be PowerShell installed, but we don't know if it's going to be PowerShell 1, PowerShell 2. PowerShell remoting is not available on PowerShell version 1, so how are we going to get that information out of there? Well, there's a couple of tools out there. Perhaps the one that's most familiar to most of you, psexec. Everyone heard of this one? It's not the best way of executing PowerShell code, but you can work with this and you can get information out of a remote system that might not have PowerShell remoting enabled. Or if you're in an environment with very strict firewalls, you might not be able to use PowerShell remoting. So you can use this as a fallback, but the downside is, because it's not PowerShell remoting, we're not going to get back objects. So let's take a look how we can use psexec, execute PowerShell commands, and get back data that we can actually use. So how are we going to get PowerShell objects out of there? So, first things first, let's run a simple command. Let's run whoami remotely. Well, locally, but let's run whoami using psexec. It's the most simple thing we can do. Then the part we're interested in is anti-authority system, because this is the data we want. But as you can see, looking at this, you see we get some header stuff, we get some stuff at the bottom. Let's get it out of there. So we could do this with regular expression matching, or well, we can see how many rows this is, so we could filter it out that way, but there's a better way to get rid of this. We can do pipe the error stream to null. Now if we run the same command, don't select it. We run the same command, we only get the output we need. So this is nice, but we're not running PowerShell yet, and we're still getting back plain text. So let's run a PowerShell command, and let's see what kind of data we're going to get back. So what we do, we run PowerShell.exe, no profile. We set the execution policy to bypass because we don't know if the system we're going to run it on is correctly configured, so we're just going to disable the execution policy. And we're going to run the following commands: get service, Windows update. So for the sake of argument, what we want to know is if the Windows update service is running. But in the situation I was in at the time, I wanted to know which systems were vulnerable. So we were running a bit more code to identify, okay, these systems are correctly patched, have the patches installed, so we could action on it. But to keep the code nice and concise, I do get service because it's a simple command that will run on every system. So let's start with this, see if this is going to work. So there we go, we get some output, we get the output from get service. Let's put it in a variable and take a look what we end up with. So we put it in output. And if we take a look at output.get type, we can see we just have a regular object, and this is just a collection of strings. So this is not very useful for our purpose, because if we are now going to output a string to a CSV file, not sure if anyone has ever done it. Does anyone know what happens if you try to convert to a CSV? I see. What happens, Matthias?
You get the length property at the end of the code.
Yeah, that's correct. So what happens when you export a string to a CSV file, there's only one property on the string. The property is length, and length just shows how long every row in an array of strings is. So it's completely useless information. So let's take a look in Excel. Well, that's fantastic. This is not going to help us at all. Well, I guess we could deduct by the length of the string if it's running or not, but it would be a bit bothersome. So let's take a look if we can do this in a better way. So I already mentioned export COI XML. Let's export it to XML and then see what we can do with that. So we exported it to COI XML. We can now run import, and now we get the actual object back. But what we're doing now is we're still using a network path, and maybe file shares are disabled. So what we want, the situation we want to end up in, is we want to get back all the information from PSXX. So let's see how we can do that. So we have a little bit more code now. So what we're going to do, we're going to export on the remote system. We're going to save it to a temp file. We're going to read in the temp file, and we're going to convert it to base64. Is everyone familiar with base64? So base64 is a way of encoding a binary file to a readable string. So it's called base64 because it's using 64 characters. It's using ABC, lowercase, uppercase, some numbers, and a couple of reading, what do you call them? What's the English word for the slashes and stuff like that? Special characters. But not the super special characters, just ones that don't break anything. So let's take a look what we end up with now. And as you notice, as I'm going through the presentation, we'll get bigger and bigger blocks of code. At the end of the demo, I'll just check with you guys if everything was clear, and otherwise you can jump back into the code. So we save this to output. So let's take a look what we have now. Awesome. We love this. We can work with this. So let's actually convert it back into a byte string. So the reason we're doing that is because we want to be able to write it back to a file. Because if we would write this to a file and try to do import COI XML, it will have no idea what we've given it. So if we take a look at this, you can see we have an array of bytes. And if we go here, we can write this back to disk. And now, if we import it, we have our object again. So, without touching disk and using PSExec, we got a PowerShell object, a deserialized PowerShell object, back from a remote system. So, to show you that we actually get back something we can use, we import it, we convert it to CSV, and now if we take a look at this, you can see we actually get some columns and some information we can use. So if we're going to query a whole bunch of systems, we can actually gather that information even when we're executing it using PSExec to get our information out of the system. So, what did we do? We used PSExec. We redirected the error stream to null. By doing so, we made sure that we only get the information we want, so actually only the output that PowerShell gives us. We executed PowerShell remotely using PSExec. We wrote it to COI XML, and we showed that we can access that using file sharing, but maybe file sharing is not available. So what we did is we wrote it to local disk and we converted it to base64, and then on our system we converted the base64 back to something we could use, so an XML file. So any questions about the code so far or why we're doing it? Yep.
No question, but I think there's another very useful case for PSExec.
Mm-hmm.
You enable PS remotely, remote on a remote machine.
Yep. So what was mentioned was another useful thing we can do. We can also enable PowerShell remoting on a system remotely by using PSExec. And PSExec is indeed one of the ways to do it. Another way to do that, this is a script, I forgot who wrote it, but it's up on postcode.org, using scheduled tasks to enable PowerShell remoting. So there's a couple of ways. The reason I'm not using PSExec to enable PowerShell remoting here is because everything was on fire. My client was on the phone asking updates every half hour. What are we supposed to do? Are we vulnerable? Have we been hacked? Are we affected? So our goal was get the information as quickly as possible, and that's what we used PSExec for. One problem with the approach, or not one problem, but one of the things I was doing, I was still writing it to disk. And writing stuff to disk, using import, export, COI, XML, it works, we get our PowerShell objects, but it's a bit of a hacky approach. And pretty much everything I'm doing is a bit of a hacky approach, because if we wanted to do this proper, we'll build a nice greenfield scenario where we have everything configured exactly the way we want it. But in reality, we won't always be in that situation, and that's how you end up doing stuff like this. So, does anyone have any idea how we can improve upon this? I know some people in the back know it, so keep your hands down. Sorry? What? Guide it to memory, and then?
I mean, that's your goal, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So that's what I'm going to do in the next demo, and it's actually quite simple because it's in PowerShell, and it has been in PowerShell since version 1, but it's something that I didn't use very often, because usually I was in environments where I was in complete control of PowerShell, and PowerShell remoting was there, so I never had to go into this. So what we're going to use now is the output format parameter of PowerShell. So let's first take a look. If we do PowerShell, there's question mark, and we go up a little bit, you can see we have output format. So we can get two different kinds of output from PowerShell. We can either get text or we can get XML. And the XML output we can get from PowerShell is actually exactly the same as what you generate if you do export COI XML and write it to disk. So let's take a look at how we can use this. In this case, in combination with PSExec, but this works everywhere. So let's use the minimap. So this was the situation we were in. We were getting the service and we were writing everything, converting it to disk and converting it to base 64. So this was a bit hacky. So let's take a look at how we can do this with output format. So now we get a very simple, very clean command, just get service Windows update. And let's see what we get. There we go, nice XML. It looks nice, but what are we going to do with this? Because we just get an XML back. And if we do get command, let's see, XML. Let's hope there's not too many. So we have convert to XML, select XML, and import and export. And import and export are going to write it to disk. So then we're still in the situation, okay, we get back the XML, but we still don't have the object. So how can we turn this into a PowerShell object? And this is actually quite cool. And if you tell PowerShell to parse the XML, it will actually turn it into a PowerShell object. So the only difference I do between the command here and here is that I put some brackets around it and the $sign to make sure PowerShell will parse this. And if we do this, we get a PowerShell object out of it. It is a bit, this was to demonstrate that PowerShell does that. We can do this even simpler. We can just put it into $output. And now if you take a look at $output, you can see, there we go, we have a PowerShell object. So actually we don't have to do anything. Just store it into a variable and PowerShell will convert it to whatever object is in the XML. So if you now take a look at the output, we can see, well, that seems to be what we want. And we can use select object and get all the additional properties, whatever is specified on there. We can get that out of there as well. The thing with using this, I already mentioned it. We are working with deserialized objects. So we do get all the properties, but they're not active properties. So if we're going to use, if we're, for example, taking a look at Win32 operating system, see, we get all the properties back. I have Windows 10, sorry. But if you do get member, a little bit up, we can see it's deserialized. And how can we see that it's actually deserialized? If I do reboot, hopefully it won't reboot. There we go. It says it does not contain a method reboot. So there are ways that you can actually convert it to something that that has all the methods again, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm just going to show how to retrieve information and get back structured objects. So what we've done now, we ran PowerShell using PSExec. We set the output format, we get the XML format, and I've showed that PowerShell, if you just put it into a variable, it will actually give you back the objects that you put in there. So we now have a nice way using PSExec to get back objects from systems that do not have do not have PowerShell remoting installed. So, any questions about this part so far? Cool. So what are we going to do next? So, we might be in a situation where we are not allowed to run PSExec, and there's actually a lot of valid reasons why that wouldn't be allowed. And if you've been to the sessions of Jared and Will, they really like PSExec, so if it's available in environments, it makes their job a lot easier. So maybe there's some kind of whitelisting going on, or you simply don't have internet access, so you cannot use these tools. So we want another fallback. So far we've done PowerShell remoting for the systems that are correctly configured, have everything installed. What are we going to do for the other systems? Like the systems on which we cannot install anything because they're highly secure, or we're simply not allowed or don't have the permissions to install anything there. Then we're going to play with WMI. Is everyone familiar with WMI? Yeah, I see people nodding. If you're not familiar, I can, after the session, we can go in depth about what we can use this for. So, let's move over to WMI. So, I'm using getWMI here. The reason I'm using getWMI is because we're simulating that we're working on systems that might not have everything installed and available. So, let's skip over this part. So, how can we execute something on a remote system? Well, we can use Win32 process to start a process on our local system. So, let's take a look at how we can do this. First, we store Win32 process in a variable, WMI proc, and I tell it to create a process PowerShell with the same commands I gave to PSExec. So, let's take a look what kind of information we get back from this. What you notice, we start a PowerShell shell. This is because I specified no exit, the PowerShell shell does actually not disappear. Also, the reason we get to see this shell is because I'm running it interactively. If we would run this against a remote system, the shell does not actually show up on people's desktop. If we take a look at the results, we can see we get back the output from whatever PowerShell did. Let's close it down. So I removed the no exec, and the difference is it just disappears right away. So the process closes after it's executed. If you do this on a remote system, as I mentioned, it doesn't show up, and this is how we want to execute code. So I've told the command to write it to an output path so we can get the information of a process we created this way. And this is still just plain text. So we want to get a way to get structured objects again. So what are we going to do? First of all, I'm going to run this remotely, without 8. So I tell it the scope and the path is going to be on psconf EU. So this is the computer name. We can put any computer name here and we can run it on a different system. So we run this code again. We can do get content and we get the information from the local disk. We can do the same using COI XML. And we can import it again. And if you do get member, and I scroll up a little bit, we can see, yeah, we get a nice deserialized object, so we get all the stuff we want again. But we have the same problem, we're touching disk again, and we don't want to touch disk. So I could make it easy by using the output encoding again, but let's take a look at a different way of doing this. So how can we get data without using a file share? So what we're going to do now is we're going to simulate writing. Well, not simulate. We're actually going to write. We're going to write the base64 encoded string into the registry. Or actually, sorry, I'm saying it wrong. We're going to write the byte stream into registry. So what we do here, we do get service. We are writing it to a temp file on disk on the remote system, but we won't be touching the file from our system. So let's execute this. And let's take a look what I've done now by using the registry. You can see, let's enable zoom it. There we go. Perfect. So we can see we now have a byte stream written to the registry. So what we can do now is we can remotely, and again using WMI, we can query the registry remotely and retrieve that byte stream from that system. So first we use WMI to execute a process on a remote system. Then we're going to retrieve the information we stored in the registry. I'm using the registry now because we can also query this using WMI. So first I'm going to make a small hash table in which I put the values where I located it. Here we go. So what I've done now, I've queried the registry using WMI on a remote system, and I stored it in a variable local bytes. If we look at the type, we can see we have an array of bytes. If we want to take a look at the output, we can see we get a nice XML file again. So this is something we can use. So as an example, we're going to write this to disk on our local system. And if we import this again, you can see we once again have an object. Let's see how I'm doing on time, so I don't get the siren. 4 minutes left. So what we've done, we use WMI to remotely start a process on the system. We store the output on disk, and then we read the output that we stored on the remote system. We stored it in the registry of that system. Then we remotely can query the registry to get the information out. So this is a way, using only WMI, to get information out of a remote system. So there's no third-party tools required. This works on down-level systems, and you can get information out of a system. Any questions about this part? Cool. So, putting it all together, I've now showed 3 different ways of getting information from a system. Let's put it into functions so we can more easily reuse this. And I'll make this code available and upload it to the GitHub repository right after the session, so you can play with it. It's GitHub PSConf EU 2018. So let's load up the functions. So I'll create 3 functions: PS remoting, PS exec, and WMI remote execution. So first of all, we'll do invoke PS remoting. We can see we get the object back, just like the earlier demo. Then we use invoke PS exec. You can see we get the information back just as we expected, and we can run the same with invoke WMI. We get the nice pop-up box because we're running it interactively. And if we take a look at the object types we get back from this, we can see we get the deserialized object. Where's the other one? The deserialized objects back from all the remote systems. So, what we've done, we've been using PowerShell to get informations when we're in a situation where we don't have full control of a situation, of an environment, and we don't know what kind of software is installed and what kind of configurations we're dealing with. So, PowerShell remoting, we use it when it's available. If we don't have PowerShell remoting, we can choose to use either PSExec or WMI. You can still execute commands. In this case, I retrieved information, but using the same methodology, you could also install patches, push stuff to a system, and just make sure you can manage your environment and get the information out when you're in a situation where you don't control it. So next up, coffee break, but first questions. And before you guys go with questions, can I get like the PowerShell gang sign from this room? Because I don't think we got a picture of everyone doing that. So left hand, 2 fingers, other hand, 1 finger. And then the trick is to see how many people are doing it wrong. So make sure you use the right hand. Okay, awesome. So any questions? Ask them now or come right up, whatever you prefer. Is there